All right, sweet. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up. We're going to talk about a book. This is the same book, just different editions. It's called Settlers. It's had several subtitles over the course of its publication history, and I think it's kind of like the newest subtitle is, I think, the worst, so we should talk about the first one, which was Settlers, A Short Course to Understanding Babylon. And Babylon is like the evil empire, like the decadent evil place of all the bad people. And the second edition is Settlers, the Mythology of the White Proletariat. And if you notice the author here, Sakai, that doesn't sound like a particularly white name, right? Sakai is actually of Japanese descent. And that kind of gives us some clues. Settlers is a critical history of white people in this country. It's a history written explicitly about white people. It's not a Japanese American writing about the history of Japanese people or Asians. It's not a black person writing about black people or a Chicano writing about history of Chicano people. It's somebody from the outside looking in, specifically a Marxist, a communist, looking in at white society and telling us what he sees in the history of white people in this country. So even if it were a terrible book, I think it would be interesting just for that reason, because a lot of times we get and this is one of the things that he talks about in the introduction to the book. He came of age in the 60s and 70s when there was a lot of demands made by blacks, like we want to be taught our own history, or Asians, we want to be taught the history of our people. We don't want to just go into school and learn about white people as if we had never contributed to the history of this country. We want to hear about us as well. And Sakai says that's a great demand. That was a good start. But what we have to do is we have to have that, and then we also have to go back to the stuff that I'm sure if everybody went to elementary school here, then you remember like the kind of history you got there, like what you were told there. We need to go back and revisit that history as well, not just kind of add to it. Like, well, here's the history of white people, and now later on we're going to learn about black people and Asians and everybody else. We need to go back to the beginning and study the history of white people in this country critically, and that's what this book is about, Settlers. So I'm just going to talk. It's a pretty thick book, as you can see, and it's not like, if this were a normal academic history book, then, first of all, the footnotes would be like that much of it, and then discussion of stuff that you don't care about would be like that much, and then the actual argument and like the evidence would be like 50 or 60 pages or something. And but there's no fluff in a book like this. It's a really very dense. And if the only thing that you get out of this presentation is you're interested enough to pick up the book, and you can get it off Amazon. There's an ebook you can buy. It's fairly cheap. There's also a PDF that is free floating out there, but you should pay this guy because he's old now, and I'm sure he doesn't have like a lavish pension, so he could use some help. And you can also get the new edition. It was out. That's the old edition. That's been out of print for a few years. They just came out with this one like a couple months ago. So if that's all you get out of this presentation, like I'm interested, I'm going to read the book, that's great. That's basically what I'm trying to do. I'm not going to go through the whole history because, like I said, we'd be here for 10 hours because there's a lot to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the author, a little bit more than I just have. Then I'm going to go through the basic thesis that he presents in the book, and then I just picked two kind of points in American history that he discusses, and I'm going to go through those from his perspective and just kind of tell you what the book says. So, and they're fairly arbitrary. I picked the American Revolution, and I'm going to talk about the New Deal too, which are two events that I think most people have some basic understanding of. Sakai has a very unique, controversial, but also I think correct take on these two events. And but like I said, he talks about a lot more. I'm going to skip over large parts of the book that I think are very important, that are like good. So just because I don't talk about them, it's only in the interest of time. It's not because I'm not picking out like the best parts of the book. So let's talk a little bit about the author. His name is Sakai. J probably stands for something, I don't know what. And he is Japanese American. He's fairly old. He was born, I think, on the West Coast during like the mid-40s. And if you put those two together, like Japanese descent, West Coast, middle of the 1940s, what was happening to Japanese people during that time, right? He grew up with a memory He may have actually been born in an internment camp. He doesn't say that, but he was born in that time where, Japanese people were living in camps that they've been forced into. So in his own life, he had an experience of like white supremacy. He grew up hearing about the camps, people talking about the camps, just as if it was the most normal thing in the world. So, and also, he tells us not only were people in his own community talking about the camps, but he was constantly having white people tell him that what they had done to the Japanese by putting them in camps wasn't that bad. Like he was getting that all throughout his childhood. Like, oh, you guys were in the camps, but it wasn't nearly as bad as what the Nazis did. He was hearing that all, throughout his early life growing up. So he had the experience of, knowing that mommy and daddy were in a camp, and then also being told by arrogant white people that, it wasn't that bad. Just forget about it, basically. So that's that's kind of the start. He was fairly poor. He had to work jobs through most of his adolescence and throughout high school, but he did go to college. And in college, he got involved. He doesn't really talk about organizations or specific people that he's been involved with, which I think part of that is like security culture. Part of it is also just humility. He doesn't want to say like, oh, I knew this guy and, we were great buds and I was a part of this organization. Like he doesn't, he'll tell stories about his past, but he never is very specific, which I think is, again, part humility, part, just being smart. But he went to school, got a degree, or at least was in college. And then like a lot of ex-student radicals during the 70s, he went down to the factories. He got a job in an auto parts plant, or he had a few jobs, but one of them was in an auto parts plant somewhere in the Midwest. And he tried to organize workers at the point of production where, because he had been in school, he had learned that that's where you do it. Like that's where the proletariat is, that's where the working class is. So you go there, and you organize them, and you get them to fight, and then eventually you have a revolution and, take over everything and build socialism. That's what he heard, so he went into the working class where he thought that was to do that. And at the same time, he was also in contact with a number of exiles from Zimbabwe and Palestine. I think he was living maybe in Chicago because he talks about working with Arabs and like knowing Palestinians, and I feel like there's a large Arab community there. So, but that's me guessing. He doesn't really say that. And those two sources, so working on the shop floor and having contact with people who had been in national liberation movements overseas, those two things kind of come together, and that's where the settlers, the unique idea that you find in this book, that's where it was born. Because when he had gone into the working class to organize them, he found out, and he'd been told that, all workers are the same, that, there's the bourgeoisie up here, there's the proletariat down here, and maybe there's some kind of contradictions among these two classes. Maybe some workers don't like each other, maybe there's racism, but overall it's one group of people that are in the same situation. They're all going to fight together eventually. All we have to do is kind of correct small errors and educate people and isolate the backwards and stuff like that. And what he discovered is that that was a simplification of to say the least, of what he discovered in on the shop floor. He found out that there were different national groups, blacks, Arabs, Chicanos, people like him, Asians, white guys, and that actually it was more than just the white guys would all hang out together at lunch, and the Asians would all hang out together at lunch. It was more sophisticated than that. During the course of all these struggles that he observed and participated in, he found out that the white guys were always the first group, even though they appeared progressive. A lot of them, he said, were Vietnam vets, and they smoked a lot of dope and hated the government. So they weren't like rednecks or complete reactionaries or whatever. But even for them, they were not willing to really go along with the agenda that the workers of color would set up. The workers of color would say, let's all unify, and the white guys would say, actually, we're going to sell you out to the boss. We're going to get a better deal. We're going to be the first to break a strike, or the first to kind of, pull away from you guys when you start doing something really radical. And so that was one thing that he observed. And then another thing was more personal. As probably the only Japanese guy working, or as an Asian, which, historically it's not there's black and white, but an Asian somewhere in the middle, it's not as determinate as those two groups. He was able to hang out with the brothers and also hang out with the white guys. And he found out that he could hang out with the black guys all the time, but the white guys were more interested in formally inviting him into their group. Like they said, we're going to go on a vacation over the weekend. Why don't you come with us? But if you're going to come with us, if you're going to like hang out with us from now on, you can't hang out with those black guys anymore. Like so he had that happen to him in his personal life, in addition to seeing, this kind of opportunism among the white workers in his group. So that experience, combined with talking with, again, Palestinians and people involved in national liberation movements, led to him to like a light bulb going on in his head, because he would always hear these Palestinians and Zimbabweans talk about settlers. They were always talking about, in the Palestinian case, they were talking about Israeli settlers and the way that they behaved and just their cohesion as a group and their racism against Palestinians, and how even, there were Palestinian workers and Israeli workers, but even among, the poorer parts of Israeli society, those guys were still racist. They still felt more affinity with, the racist ruling class of, Israel than they did with anybody in Palestine. And these Palestinians who had been through, again, by the 70s, we're talking like 20, 30 years of genocide, at least, they were, using this word to describe the Israelis. And J. Sakai kept hearing this from them, and then also obviously hearing about the situation in Zimbabwe where white imperialists invaded the country, took the best land, forced the Africans to work on it for next to nothing. That's recently been changed, though, by Comrade Mugabe. So let's salute to Comrade Mugabe. And anyway, so he was getting, and they were also referring to the white people who had settled on their land as settlers, and they were talking about them in the same way. Like, it doesn't matter if they're poor, they're overseers. The poorest white guys are overseeing us and like just as racist as the rich guys. And one day, J. Sakai got, kind of the mind to ask, I think it was one of these two guys, to ask them if they thought the same situation that existed in Israel and Palestine was in America, or if the same situation that they saw in Zimbabwe was also, also could explain American history. And without any discussion or anything, they said, yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I thought that you knew that, right? These guys, these Palestinians and people from Zimbabwe had assumed that that's the way that Americans looked at their own history. But that was actually, for Sakai, it was actually a very unique, and I think for most people, it's a very unique way of looking at the history of this country that we don't think about. We think about, if I can recall like my own education in American history, we memorized the names of the tribes in upstate New York. We memorized like where they lived, like in the lakes that they were the closest to. And then we talked about the American Revolution and then just never mentioned Native people ever again. And it's like, okay, well that's kind of bizarre, right? And then maybe in the last section of the book, we talk about how America is now multicultural and we have all these different groups here. And then maybe natives would get a mention in this kind of long list of people that also live in America, right? But between initially talking about natives and then mentioning that they still live here, there's like no mention of them at all, and no mention of what happened to them, and no mention of like what white people did to natives. And like in New York, at least the history of New York, the Iroquois nation was practically, not totally, but practically exterminated after the American Revolution in reprisal for their alliance with the British. And the same heroes of the American Revolution who fought for freedom were also the ones that were like systematically burning Iroquois villages and like murdering everybody above the age of 10. And that happened not just in upstate New York, but like all over the original 13 colonies, all over most parts of this country. And it's just, you don't hear that. You never hear, you hear that there were conflicts and that there was racism. You don't hear about like different nations fighting to subjugate one another. That's not how like elementary school history goes. And maybe, I don't know, that might be psychologically pretty damaging for like small children to hear about that, but on a certain level, like we should get, eventually, maybe we give the kids like maybe we just don't talk about history until they're ready to deal with genocide in high school or something like that. I don't know, but the thing is like you get a very simplified version of history. You get a very like washed down, watered down version, even when you're talking about like the more advanced stuff, like maybe Howard Zinn, I think is maybe, like I don't remember Howard Zinn going into the level of detail that J. Sakai does. I mean, he'll mention atrocities, he'll mention that these things happen, but he won't explain them in the same way. It will be like, it's unfortunate that it happened this way, or the racism of white people was unparalleled at this time, and they did these terrible things. But there's no explanation of why, what the reason was why white people just couldn't live with blacks, why whites and blacks couldn't ever do the same kind of work, why there had to be black slaves and white overseers, why that was, and I don't know, at least maybe I'm misconstruing, and it's been a while since I read it, but at least for me, Sakai is making a different and more correct argument, and he's very careful to attribute it to these people, who had been through national liberation movements, and it just seemed natural to them to look at the world in this way. So anyway, that's enough about him. He's still alive, still publishing. He wrote a good book, or it's not really a book, it's like a pamphlet about security culture that, again, just came out like a couple months ago. Maybe we should talk about that at some point in the future. But yeah, that's where Settlers comes from, that kind of fusion of working on the shop floor and listening to people talk about their experiences in national liberation movements. And originally he thought he was just going to write an article about white people in the labor movement. He thought he was going to write a short article about how white people came to be racist, how it happened that white people decided they could set themselves up over people of color in workplaces and get a better deal. And he said, maybe I'll have to go back to the 1930s or the 1940s. Maybe that's when it happened. Maybe that's when white people broke away from everybody else. And the way that he describes it, he says he went all the way back to the beginning of this country and never found a point when there wasn't this basic separation between whites and others, when there wasn't, this very distinct line between the labor that white people were supposed to do and the things that they were allowed to have, and the labor and the things that were set aside for colonial people. And that's the origin of this book. So what is the thesis? I've sort of talked about it a little bit. It's basically that America isn't a normal country, and that it hasn't been a normal country like England, to the extent that England was normal, where you have, the English ruling class and then English workers. And, the English ruling class doesn't like the workers, and but they need them to make money, and there's battles, and the working class organizes and forms unions and fights back, and then there's, repression and this sort of thing. And it's mainly concentrated in this one main national group. In America, from the very beginning, that hasn't been the case. There's always been several different nations. There's been, white people, there's been blacks, there's been natives, there's been Chicanos, there's been all these different groups. And from the very beginning, each one of them has had their own kind of stratifications. There's, white ruling class, white workers. There's, to some extent, a native ruling class, native workers, right? And then what's happened from the very first colonies, from the very first tiny European settlements in America, is that the white nation has always considered itself the center of an empire. And they have always considered it their right and their duty even to take over the land, to destroy people that oppose them, and to order everything that they see for their exclusive benefit. And that's been the truth to varying, and we're going to get into that, how that varies, to varying degrees from Mayflower to modern, from the beginning of what became the United States all the way down to the present. So that's pretty vague, and maybe sounds actually kind of objectionable. So let's get into some concrete examples so it's more clear and we see what he's saying. The first example I picked is the American Revolution. And I picked it because it's sort of, most people know about it, know the basic details. And we also get a certain story. We know that there were the colonists, and they had their farms and fields and their businesses and shipyards and stuff like that. And they were trading and working industriously, and they were, there was conflicts with the Indians, obviously. They were fighting for the same resources. But basically they were, fair, honest people who just wanted a better life for themselves. They came to this country for religious freedom or land, or to get something for their family. And then across the ocean George III, who wants to oppress the colonists and destroy them and force them to pay taxes that they don't want to pay and force them to, I don't know, like not trade with other people, only trade with England, and not give them representation. That's what you hear, no taxation without representation. And we hear that the American Revolution came out of this conflict. The settlers wanted to trade more freely. They wanted, to provide more for their families. They wanted, freedom that any man would want for his family to like run his farm, work hard, and through his hard work be rewarded, and not have some tyrant steal things from him through taxation. And Sakai obviously has a totally different interpretation of this conflict. And I think even most liberals would have a different interpretation. They would say, oh, it was more cynical than that. I mean, they owned slaves, there was this. But I don't think liberals have as good an explanation of the reasons for that conflict emerging in the way that it was resolved as Sakai does. So Sakai looks at it as there was a lot less contradiction between like the British ruling class and the colonists than we assume. I mean, obviously, in a perfect world, for the British, they just wanted the colonists to be quiet, grow a lot of tobacco and sugar and cotton and just send it to them at cheap prices and not trade with anybody else. And, people in Britain would reap most of the profits. That's what they wanted. And in the colonies, they wanted something different. They wanted total control over their ability not only to produce and trade, but most importantly, and this is critical, this is the main reason Sakai identifies for the American Revolution, or one of the main reasons. They wanted the freedom to continue settling. Sakai says that the real break between the British ruling class and the colonists came with the Proclamation of 1763, which was white settlement was going to be stopped in the Appalachian Mountains. You weren't going to be allowed to move beyond that. And that was, the British did that not because they loved the Indians. They had no love for them whatsoever. But in that period, they saw that the settlers were antagonizing the Indians a little bit too much. And this was, not advantageous to the British because, again, they're not in America. They're overseas. What they want is cheaper prices for the raw materials that are going into their factories. And the Indians are giving them a great deal on furs and all these other things. And the colonists, are just going to mess up their profitable trading arrangement. That's what the British are thinking, right? And the colonists obviously are in a totally different situation, especially the slave-owning colonists. They know that if they don't expand production, they're going to die out. They're not going to be able to, they're going to lose out to the people in the north. They need to be able to expand slavery as far as they can take it. And everybody in America wanted land. That's the only reason, that's the main reason white people came to America, not to practice their religion freely or whatever, but to get land nearly for free. Sakai compares the prices in the early colonial period to the prices in England, and you could get like an acre. It wasn't even an acre; it was more than that. Like a large chunk of land for a single day's wage. I think it maybe was an acre, or like 5 acres or something, and of good land for working for one day. Which, if you can translate that into like your wages today, like I don't know, I made like $90 today. Can I get an acre of land for $90? Like, no, if I could, that would be incredible. And who on earth would work, right? For, if you could get like great farmland for almost nothing. And that's one of the problems they had in the early colonial period that led to slavery. They couldn't get white people to work, like, which is sort of funny because what's the constant refrain about immigrants in like America today? Like they're taking jobs from Americans. Like there's no jobs that Americans won't do. We'll do all the jobs. Like we don't need it, whatever. That's one of the things about this book that's so good. You see just the rhetoric repeat itself over and over again, and that's why I recommend that people read the book. There's so many times in here where I was in the middle of a paragraph and I just, you just have to sit like, did I hear that last week on KSL? Like, is that, So one of the things that you hear a lot is the accusation of being a lover, like a nigger lover, or a lover of the Indians, or a friend of the natives. Like that's one of the worst things you hear in the book. The worst insult that a settler can throw at another settler is that you're a friend of, our enemy, of our dread racial enemy. And how many conservatives today actually believe that Barack Hussein Obama is somehow in cahoots with terrorists in some weird way because he has this foreign-sounding middle name. I don't know. So that's kind of an aside, though. That's not really what I want to talk about. Anyway, Sakai identifies the main contradiction being that the settlers wanted to go all the way to the Pacific with their, they wanted to take all the land between where they were and the next ocean, and they wanted to put slaves everywhere. And the British, who wanted to restrain things for their own kind of short-term economic benefit. And obviously, we know what happened, the American Revolution, the settlers won. And during the course of that revolution, we see that there was this kind of strange conception of freedom that both sides had. Like the settlers wanted freedom, but the freedom that they meant was freedom for them to expand slavery or take other people's land. And they did mean freedom of trade. That is in a sense, that's part of what they meant. But the other, the British across the ocean were looking at these colonists saying, it's ridiculous that you claim to be defending freedom. You can't defend freedom when you have slaves. You can't defend freedom when you treat natives the way that you guys do. And then the Americans, of course, would hurl the exact same insult back across the ocean, which was that the British had built their empire on slave trading, and they still depended, they built all kinds of ships and were involved in the triangular trade. And they had banned slavery, or maybe they hadn't banned slavery quite yet, but they were kind of drawing it down. But they had no moral ground to...
Some percent decision.
Yeah, when was that?
Prior to the American Revolution.
Okay, all right. I wasn't sure if it was... All right. So they had banned it, but, the Americans were saying, oh, you guys depend on the slave trade still. You're making all these ships, and they're used to sell slaves, and, Anyway, so the point is that both sides were right. Neither side was defending liberty in the sense that I think a reasonable person would understand it. They were defending their liberty to continue to have slaves. And that's borne out, the fact that neither side was really, the fact that both sides were in it for themselves, and one side defended liberty that included the freedom to own slaves. That was borne out in the alliances that different groups, different nations in the Americas adopted during the course of the Revolutionary War. White settlers, obviously, there were some loyalists, but most of them fought against the crown, for land. Towards the end of the war, enlistment in the Continental Army had to be stimulated by offering settlers hundreds of acres of land that hadn't been seized yet, that was going to be seized from different Indian nations on the border, right after the war was over. So it's sort of like it was like a bet or something. We're going to win, and if we do win, we're going to take this army we have and get everybody some land, basically. So that's what happened. That happened towards the end of the war. But even before that, the native nations that were left bordering the settlers, almost all of them went along with the British. They voted for the British, and that actually voted for the French before, in the middle of the 18th century during the French and Indian War, because the French were slightly nicer to them. But they saw very clearly what the settlers were planning to do, what their liberty meant. They knew that if these guys win, if the settlers win, the first thing they're going to do is dive right over the Appalachians and take, as much land as they possibly can, which is exactly what happened. They were totally right in choosing to fight for the British. The other main group that went along with the British was African slaves. There were large formations of ex-slaves that escaped to British lines and joined. There were whole battalions that were formed of ex-slaves. There was the Ethiopian battalion. A lot of them were used as labor, to build roads or whatever, but a lot of them did actually fight. And that was one of the things that really took the war up to the next level when the British said that, when they offered freedom to any slave that managed to get to them and fought till the war's end. And that actually forced the colonists to enlist their own slaves and promise them freedom, right? And Sakai points this out several times also. It happened during the American Revolution and also during the Civil War that at certain times, even nations that are as miserably oppressed and deprived of power as the black nation was at this time, sometimes when there's a clash between, in this case, the British and the settlers in America, the oppressed and kind of like sneak in the middle and play both sides off against each other. Most of the time, though, it's the other way around. Most of the time, it's a white ruling class playing off different nations against one another, or playing off its own working class against blacks. But there's some times where, in this case, both sides are offering freedom if you fight for us, and black people get a comparatively good deal. And also during the chaos of the war, as much as like 10 or 15,000 slaves just escaped and made it to Canada. So, but they were not. Again, you're not going to see that in elementary school. Like, you're not going to hear about like the class alliances or whatever. And Sakai's making the point that we can talk about the history of blacks and the history of natives. We need to make the point that like all these groups were opposed to whites for a very, very good reason during the time at which white settlers were fighting for what they thought was freedom, and what we're still told today is like the freedom of the American people.
What are when you think of literature from the American Revolution, again, just based on my elementary school
right.
education, think of like Thomas Paine and all this stuff. You're saying like freedom this, freedom that.
Yeah.
Where, what kind of documents, or where would some of the ideology be articulated where they're saying, hey, let's kick out the British because we need land, or let's kick out the British because we want to maintain slavery? Were there certain people that articulated those views very clearly, that were like leaders? Again, in contrast to, say, Thomas Paine, who's
right.
talking about freedom. But
yeah, I have my answer, but do you want to?
Declaration of Independence. It's right in there. It's right in there that the British Crown forbids us from expanding our trade and whatnot, and is stirring up the Indians against us. Like, if you actually read beyond like the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, there's like a list of reasons why they were pissed off, and it's just like they forbade us from expanding. Like, it literally says that. They sought to seize our property, and I think it even says including our slaves or something. Like, it's very, like, if you just get past the we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, and get to the actual list, it's like super explicit.
also, find out one quick follow-up is,
yeah.
after the war, how quickly was there that expansion into Native American territory? I mean, was it like in a few years following, just like
it was
massive?
In some cases, it happened like during the same time. Like, I think the Iroquois, the attacks on the Iroquois happened like immediately after the British were kicked out of New York, which was in like the middle of the war. Or again, it's been a while since elementary school. I've kind of forgotten, but it was
pretty quick transition.
Yeah, it was like the same army, the same people. It was like, we're already here. We might as well. And because to them it was part of the same war, because the Iroquois had allied themselves with the British. So they were really fighting the British, even though it was, they had plans to destroy the Iroquois already, obviously. But yeah.
Just kind of two things. So I did mention the Somerset a minute ago. The reason I brought that up was, again, that the British were actively out working to eliminate slavery. Not that because they were super aggressive, but
yeah.
So Joe Horn has a thesis who came out with a book this year called Counter-Revolution 1776, and essentially argues that the American Revolution was a reaction to the British trying to outlaw slavery, in an attempt to sort of solidify that as an institutional practice, which they did in America. And then the second thing I wanted to talk about was in response to Will's comment about when did they start doing this. George Washington had explicit policies. It's essentially either go out, conquer, civilize where you can, right? We can sort of maybe civilize these people, or just exterminate them. Almost like Washington's policies.
I mean, I guess I knew that Washington had killed a lot of Native Americans before the Revolutionary War, but then he was involved in that type of stuff after.
As the President of the United States, those are his policies.
And also, I don't know, it's just something else, like so you're talking about documents and certain things, like Thomas Paine, I'm not sure if he supported slavery or not. I know there were a number of like pretty prominent liberal philosophers and like very liberal people, like Thomas Jefferson, somebody that we would call a liberal. His plan for the African race, and this was actually something that people discussed, because they were aware that having all these slaves was a danger to them, not because it was inhumane, but because it was potentially the slaves could revolt and kill us, and actually after the American Revolution, Jefferson predicted there might be a change in the status of, how did he put it? It was like he might have even used the word revolution, or like a revolving of the status of whites and blacks in this country if we don't handle the Negro problem effectively. And his solution, Jefferson's solution to the black problem in this country was, obviously they needed the labor, but they needed to gradually wean themselves off of slavery. So his solution wasn't to give Africans freedom in America. It was to keep the adults here, but any babies they had, just sell them into slavery in the West Indies. And eventually you would just run out of people. So it's like a Children of Men type horror situation. He was discussing this in letters with people in his richly appointed, very civilized looking study in Monticello, and everybody was sitting around like, yes, this is a very practical solution to this problem that us white people have. So I don't know. Sakai, obviously he doesn't take any quarter in this book, and yeah.
So just from the Declaration of Independence, here's where
there we go. Okay.
The criticism is you're not allowing more settlers, and you're not allowing us to expand into Indian lands. He says, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. And then just right down below that, let me see if I can find it. Oh, there's another one. Here we go. He has excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So it's right there. It's like we want more settlers, we want more lands, we want to kill all the Indians. Yeah, I can't find the slaves one, but it's in there.
I guess I should emphasize the point about the Somerset decision. If America had remained a colony to the crown, it would have been subject to the rule of law of the crown. So the Somerset decision would have applied in the colonies, hence no more slaves.
All right, and it's funny, the thing that Jefferson accuses the Indians of, what was it? What was the line again, Greg?
Oh, hold on, let me find it.
This is Jefferson or
This is Jefferson, Declaration of Independence.
The merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
Yeah. So that's exactly what the settlers did. That's another thing you see in the book. Settlers constantly accusing their victims of the barbarity that they actually do.
Like Zionists, same game.
Yeah, and we were talking about that earlier. This guy was in contact. He was on the shop floor in the 70s, seeing racism and chauvinism and stuff like that. And then he was also in contact with Palestinian exiles, and they were referring to Israelis as settlers. And one day he asked them, hey, do you think it's the same thing in the U.S.? And they were like, yeah, sure. And that's.
That's what the Israelis said.
Yeah, that's what the Palestinians said that he met, and that's that's why the book is called what it is. So.
Well, sometimes Israelis, if you say, hey, you're ethnically cleansing this territory of the indigenous inhabitants, Palestinians, that's bad. They'll say, well, their great example is they say, well, you did that in the United States,
right.
So
yeah.
why can't we
here? Yeah.
Theoretically, we've realized that you're not supposed to exterminate other races.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, in the U.S., but in Israel, that's still just commonly used as a justification to say, hey, we're just doing what all the white people do.
Right. Right. Yeah, and the justification that you see a lot crop up in this book from white philosophers and leaders is that the Indians are savage. They're backwards. We have the light of civilization. We have the right to use the land and make it fruitful. And hearing them talk about how they made the land fruitful sort of reminded me of the Israeli thing about, we made the desert bloom, we took this land that was being mishandled and, did something with it. So it's the same the same rhetoric in the similar situations. So we talked a little bit about the outcome of the Revolutionary War. I don't know. I guess I want to jump into something a little bit more recent because, like I said, there's literally like a million things I could talk about in this book. But I just want to give just a little taste. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the New Deal, which is a pretty drastic leap into the future. I apologize, but basically the New Deal was a response to a pretty unprecedented wave of strikes in America that happened. The 20s were kind of a bad decade for organizing. There were small victories, but after the Red Scare, basically in the late 19-teens, there had been a big ebb of leftist organizing and unionizing among everybody, white, black, Chicano, whoever. But there was this wave, especially that was made much worse by the Great Depression, which gave a lot of white workers a pretty tremendous shock. Like, the system is collapsing. Like, we need to look at radical alternatives to what we have today. There were all kinds of extremely militant strikes, sit-down strikes, where the workers would physically occupy a building for as long as, I think the longest one, the Flint sit-down strike was almost 3 months. And when you think about a sit-down strike for 3 months in a major factory that has to be defended by a couple thousand people, they had to run food in every day. They had to control the streets and fight back cops. And we're seeing some of this happen today where people are picking up tear gas canisters and throwing them back. This is, if you read the history of workers, white workers strikes in the 30s, it's unbelievable. They were making cops run for their lives, which is something that, you see people throwing tear gas cans back and building barricades. You don't see the cops ever really retreating. I'm saying this was extreme. This was another level of class struggle that was going on. And the result of all this militancy was not repression as it had been in the past. There have been all kinds of massacres of miners and striking workers before. People have been thrown in prison. The IWW, which he talks a lot about in this book, there's a whole chapter on it, really good. I can't talk about it because this is already 15 minutes into the presentation or something like that. The IWW had been just completely smashed overnight in the Palmer raids. Huge organization, totally gone. So it's not like the American government wasn't ever going to use weapons on white workers or wasn't going to beat down white labor when it got out of line. But there was something different about the New Deal and the strikes that led up to it. They were very militant. They were very, out there, but also the response from the Roosevelt administration and from state governments. Well, state governments were demanding that he send in troops, and Roosevelt kept saying, no, we're not going to do that. And if you compare that to the response of the Missouri governor today, we're going to nationalize we're going to send the National Guard in anticipation of a jury verdict being revealed. It's a totally, again, it's night and day comparing what's happening, the level of just militarization, and we're going to crush the possibility of a protest. We're going to mobilize even before that happens. In the 30s, they were saying the National Guard won't be sent out. We're not going to send the army in. We're not going to interfere with these disputes between the companies and the labor unions, which in practice meant that the companies had to settle. They had to give into the demands of all these different unions. Mainly they were affiliated with the CIO at this time, which was the AFL was an older organization that was in the 30s was bought out, in a lot of cases literally bribed with huge amounts of money by different companies that it was unionized at. And the CIO was a newer organization that promised that it was going to it promised to white workers that they were going to get a better deal, that they were actually going to fight back, and it promised to black workers that it was going to fight Jim Crow, and it only did one of those two things. It only basically was a union for white people. And it was effectively given the go-ahead by the government. The government could have easily rushed in and crushed it, but it didn't. They held back. And as a result, all these different corporations were forced to respond with concessions, and we'll recognize your union, and we'll give you what you want, basically. And as a result, Roosevelt, and for the programs that Roosevelt proposed, as a result, Roosevelt was a hero of this. The AFL represented like the top, like the labor aristocracy of white people, basically, and the CIO was more on the bottom. The New Deal represented kind of the addition of this group of workers who had been very militant in making their demands. It represented their kind of addition to like respectable politics. Their unions were recognized instantly. They joined the Democratic Party, a lot of these people, Roosevelt's Democratic Party, and got elected to offices all over the country. They were very influential in a lot of cities. They were able to kick out police commissioners who had been anti-labor, who had like busted strikes, which is, if you think about that, like how great would that be if we could do that? But it all happened. It happened very easily compared to a lot of other struggles that have been crushed in the past. And Sakai makes the argument that the New Deal was not actually won by this kind of militant struggle. It was won by a kind of strategic calculation on the part of a certain sector of like the government. We're going to give these people what they want so that we can secure their loyalty for the future, for what turned out to be the war effort, which led, in World War II, which led to the United States having this globally dominant position that it still has today. And if they had been worried during World War II about the kind of labor issues that were happening in the 30s, who knows like how effective the military would have been overseas. I mean, they needed a lot of people working. They needed factories to go, night and day producing tanks and planes and everything. And if they hadn't had that, who knows, right? And that was Roosevelt and the Democratic Party making a calculation. And he makes the comparison between the way that white militancy of the CIO was treated and the way that Puerto Rican militancy at around the same time was being handled. There was a Puerto Rican nationalist movement in the 30s that was huge. There were, school children were like ripping down the American flag from outside of their school. There were large, gatherings of thousands of people, marches all the time. People were demanding independence. There was and Sakai puts these two events side by side. There was a militant strike, right? 90-day strike, totally illegal, wildcat, in Flint, Michigan, that shut the plant down. Battles in the streets with cops fearing for their lives, like all sorts of rampant law breaking and violence. There was a legal march in Puerto Rico that was totally cleared with the authorities beforehand. Permits were signed and sealed and everything. It was open, and there was, it was lined. There were soldiers that were stationed to make sure that things didn't get out of hand. During the middle of the march, for some reason that's never been determined, the American soldiers stationed around this march, who knew that it was going to happen, who had anticipated that, who knew the march's route, knew who was organizing it, had no reason to fear any sort of violence or anything. They just started opening fire, like on the crowd, on the crowd of people who were marching peacefully, and there was like 20 or 30 people were killed. And all the leaders of the Puerto Rican nationalist movement were found and arrested on trumped up charges and tossed in jail. So he puts those two things side by side, and he said the U.S. government at this time wasn't weak. It was totally capable of responding to threats to its power with violence. So we need to look at the New Deal in a different light and look at the labor struggles that led to it in a different light. Look at it as a kind of deal that was reached between two parts of the population and not as like this titanic struggle of labor versus capital. And the other thing is, I totally forgot to mention this, I should have talked about this. A lot of the demands of the CIO during this time, like this really, we're going to take over factories, we're going to, fuck bosses and stuff like that. Fuck the boss, excuse me, came out wrong. Anyway, you know what I'm saying though. One of the demands that were, some of these demands weren't kept secret, but a lot of them were. There were always racial demands attached to the demands for a higher wage, the demand for time off, the demand for pensions. Next to all of these benefits that, you would ask for in any strike negotiation, was the demand that either black people never be hired in the plant at all, or they'd be hired only in very small numbers and kept kept in the worst type of jobs. So for instance, in a car manufacturer place, like the worst jobs are in the foundry, where you're pouring molten metal everywhere, and those were the jobs, or janitor jobs. That's where the black people would work, and the white people would be on the production line. And blacks were not allowed onto the production line in large numbers until the 1960s, basically. And that was a demand that was established by this white movement of labor during the New Deal. So when we hear like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren talk about the New Deal and how we need to, or like recall that era with nostalgia, or the politics that led to that era with some sort of nostalgia, like when I hear that, I always think about the history that Sakai goes through.
I think you bring up a lot of good points about how that one policy was disproportionately applied. But also a lot of people indicate that that's FDR's crowning legacy, like the thing that we'll remember him for. There's also at least two other policies we should keep in mind. One is Executive Order 1966, which was, as you mentioned earlier, Sakai, Japanese internment was FDR. If you want to say more on that, that's great. The second policy was actually a rejected policy to eliminate lynching as a practice in the United States.
I thought he got that through. I thought he managed to eliminate lynching. He didn't? Okay. I know he proposed it, but I didn't know that. Okay.
I actually think he combated it. I could look up, and I could be wrong on that.
Huh. Okay.
Something to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just saying, like, this is the thing that everybody always talks about as being like the foundation of the American middle class, like strong, good jobs for hardworking people. Like, we have to remember, like, all of these words, middle class, hardworking people, like all these words are color coded, basically. Like, there's a certain, in this case, a racial attachment to those words. And the New Deal was, not like this kind of concession on the part of power towards, it was, in a way, it was a concession on the part of the government towards a specific group, but it wasn't a concession to all of the people, all the people equally. It was uneven, and it was uneven in a predictable, racist way.
So would you say it was a concession to the white working class in order to stop the formation of a multinational working class?
Yeah, I think that's always been a danger that, going back to like the early colonial period when there would be white indentured labor and black slaves working on the same plantations. That's always been a danger that I think has been effectively crushed at different moments. So, and we can talk about, I don't know how long this has gone on, but we should talk about like the future and how things are changing, because this book ends in the 1970s. So if we're going to talk about the multinational nature of the working class today, that would be, I think, that would be good. But Sakai is only, he's dealing with an slightly older period than we're living in. So, but I still think it's very good history, because it reminds us of, like, I don't know, at the very least, to not be uncritical of unions or uncritical of populist rhetoric, especially in a context where, we have different national groups and national oppression, like power to the people, like which people? What does that mean? Like the Tea Partiers want to take this country back, who are they taking it from? Like, what does that mean? I had a professor at the U, what's his name? Coleman, I think. The only black history professor at the U, I think his name's Ronald Coleman. And he was talking about, this was during the Tea Party, the heyday of the Tea Party movement, and he said, yeah, they're saying take the country back, and that means something to me. Like, I know what that means, And then we talked about Jim Crow and slavery and everything. So, and I think that, again, we just need to be, at the very least, after we read this book, wary of that type of stuff.
Actually, this is interesting. I'm doing a little cursory research.
Sweet.
So actually, there were numerous laws passed and spearheaded by the NAACP at the time. The reasons why Roosevelt actually rejected a lot of them was because he thought he would lose Southern support for the New Deal.
Yeah.
So, a historic practice that killed probably 5,000 people or more
Mm-hmm.
in the United States was put on hold for the New Deal.
Yeah. And that you see that a lot too in even in the IWW, there was a kind of, we can't offend the sensibilities of what's assumed to be like the majority of people, like the middle class or the reasonable person in this country. And Sakai, as Japanese American, talks about the way that the IWW dealt with the Japanese. There was a lot of hatred against Chinese, but the Chinese were kicked out, so after that there wasn't any Chinese left to hate on. So the Japanese were the next kind of target of like just racial hatred for white people in the Western United States. And the IWW was, you know, a lot of its members were poor white, you know, right off the boat from Central Europe, you know, with a long history of like class struggle, militant struggle against bosses. They hated their bosses, and they also hated the racial repression that they saw in America. They were not in favor of it at all. They didn't support it. It was disgusting to them, and they made an effort to like include, you know, as many national groups in their unions as they could and work on as equal a basis as they thought was practical. And an example of what practical means is the way that they dealt with the Japanese. They wanted the Japanese in their union, but they didn't want too many of them because they were afraid that if they had too many Japanese people, then the IWW would be accused of being a friend of the Japanese, and that would just ruin its reputation among the rest of the community. So in order to, you know, keep its reputation intact, again, it's like completely, you know, if that's the kind of reputation you're trying to keep intact, whatever. But in order to keep its reputation intact, they asked that Japanese members be inconspicuous in the organization and just not show up for things if they were asked to stay home, you know, and not really recruit. I mean, if you're already in the workplace that we're organizing, that's fine. You can be a member. But all Japanese workplaces, we're not gonna organize. We're gonna stay away from that, just out of a sense of, you know, we don't want to lose the support of people. And I mean, that was the IWW. That wasn't FDR. That was a radical syndicalist organization that wanted the overthrow of capitalism, and they were still unable to kind of overcome that barrier to like solidarity. So, which he does talk about. He does talk about some examples of cross-racial solidarity. The St. Patrick Battalion that fought for Mexico in the Mexican-American War is an example he discusses. The St. Patrick Battalion, they were Irish immigrants who, again, like straight off the boat.
You know, that's why the Irish never do something like that.
Well, no, they did.
That's racist.
Well, you should read this book, though. You should read this book because he talks about how that happens, how the Irish changed.
One moment for the Irish people, I'm proud of mine.
But yeah, there's like a monument to them in Mexico City. They fought, they got off the boat in America and were like, this place is fucking awful. You know, the Americans are treating the Mexicans the same way that the British treated us in Ireland. So we're going to fight. And also they're Catholic and the Americans are part. So that maybe that was, I think the more prominent element was the class element, though, I would say, not the religious element, at least for them, because they put their opposition to Americans in terms of like the way they were treating the Mexicans, like the genocide and, you know, all that stuff. So yeah, they fought for the Mexican government for several years. Hundreds of them died, and there's a plaque in Mexico City, the Patricio Battalion or something.
So I have two related questions. So you've pointed out that, like, especially with the, it seems like there's three things going on. First is the ability of the United States to buy off white settlers through westward expansion and exploitation of resources and land. It seems like that's done. Like, that's as far as it's going to get.
Yeah.
It's West Coast. The next thing you talked about was buying off white workers through conceding, like, union struggles and improving conditions, etc.
Yeah.
With the economic crisis, it seems like that's not really a feasible thing to me personally, but I'd like to know if you think it's a feasible thing.
Yeah.
And then the third thing is the 60s, right? Conceding benefits of world empire to the white working class and denying them to other nations. Given the status of the United States in the world, that seems becoming, if not unfeasible now, becoming increasingly unfeasible. So one, would you agree with sort of that assessment of the world situation and the economic situation? And if so, then isn't it, if not impossible, extraordinarily difficult for the United States in a multipolar world to divide the working class through the strategy of white supremacy? And in fact, aren't we now seeing the possibility of building a multinational working class?
Yeah, so the first question, that kind of trajectory you described of having land, resources, and then bribing and then using the fruits of empire, I think that's accurate. And I think the economic crisis has definitely poked holes in that. We're seeing like one of the biggest threats one of the biggest reasons why the U.S. is such a threat is its ability to use the dollar as like a weapon, and you can only buy oil with dollars, and this is extremely important. And if that changes in the future, then American debt that's denominated in dollars is going to be not worth as much, and nobody's going to be able to get a mortgage or a credit card, basically. Like that's kind of like the next crisis that some economists are talking about happening in the future. And if that happens, then we're going to be in a situation sort of like 1929, where there's a broad like collapse of everything. Banks fail. That's the definition of like a really big crisis, when banks fail. Like individual companies fail, that's bad, but when banks, like when the whole financial system is shot, then you really have a problem.
Like Bear Stearns.
Yeah. Well, the thing is the crisis though, that wasn't a 1920. At least in my opinion, that was forestalled. We still they just pumped a lot of money into the system and they're keeping it going. They did manage to avoid a 1929 type situation then. But it's a question of like when the next crisis is and how long that strategy is gonna keep going. So basically I agree though that it's becoming harder. As for the ability to build a multinational working class, I think that depends on, like you said, the ability of just raw ability of the U.S. to bribe people and like have benefits to share with like certain groups. I think there's still like the kind of psychological wage, I guess, that Du Bois talked about. Like, even poor whites knew that they were white. Like during Jim Crow times, like they knew that they could vote. They could theoretically be elected to office. They didn't have to, they could carry weapons. Like there were all these things. Even if there's a crash in the living standard, I don't think that automatically leads people to immediately feeling solidarity with people that they used to hate, 10 years ago, I guess.
In fact, it almost seems like the opposite. It seemed like when the financial crisis hit a few years ago, that was when suddenly hatred of immigrants and Latinos reached its apex, and all those laws to try to, just make things worse for undocumented immigrants. So it's like, obviously people's anger is often directed in the wrong way. Instead of being upset at the elite classes, they just kind of blame the brown people there.
Right. I think that's also, not to like get into this millennial shit, like is there a divide between millennials and their parents or whatever, but I think there is kind of a gap. I think younger people are frankly less reactionary just because they're young, and I think that they're more able to, they're less set in their ways, and if you came of age after a financial crisis and in a period where you're working alongside people that your parents wouldn't have worked alongside with, maybe you have a different attitude. I don't know. That could be, maybe it'll change over time. I think the prospects are better, but I also think that, sort of like what we talked about last time, that economic depression a lot of times leads to pretty horrible things and not like solidarity.
The Nazis.
Right. I was just gonna actually bring that up. I don't know. That's. I think we've probably had a few lectures where we haven't mentioned the Nazis, but I think most lectures, like there's some, we slip it in somehow, like it comes up. So anyway, are there any other questions or comments about this great book? You can get it on Amazon. You can get it directly from the Kurzblätterdeb site. Sorry, if whoever's watching this has that name. I don't know how to pronounce it. And I think you should buy it. If somebody wants to take my copy home and read it, you're totally welcome to. So.
And if you could spell out the publisher or
how about we just put the link in the video description? Yeah, we can do that. So, yeah.
Let's hear it for Kyle.
Thank you.
So it's that time again, folks. Time for the 20-minute song of the International.